Roger, we're going to talk today about God's reconciliation. So let's start by exploring what we mean by reconciliation.
Well, reconciliation is the process by which broken relationships are brought back together again. Something has happened to impair relationship between two people, two groups of people, two nations even. And reconciliation is the process by which that is repaired. But it's more than that as well. It's to try and achieve a new level of relationship. It's not just restoring what happened in the past, but trying to achieve something new and more positive for the future.
And we're going to look specifically at the parable of the prodigal son. Why is that a good example of reconciliation?
The parable of the prodigal son has everything in it you want to know about reconciliation. There are three characters. The prodigal who goes off on his own and does what he wants to do, and in so doing fractures the relationships. You have an elder brother who exacerbates the situation by wanting an overweening sense of justice. Mm-hmm. And you've got the father in the middle trying to hold the gap between these two brothers who have fallen apart and trying to bring them together.
So what is it that the prodigal son does, and why is it so damaging?
Well, the prodigal son comes from a well-established family. He doesn't want for anything. His father's a landowner. He has a very comfortable lifestyle. But he gets the idea in his head he wants to go off and explore the world and take some of his inheritance with him. And in some respects, that's an entirely natural thing to do. Many of us at different stages of our lives want to explore what's out there, to realise our potential. God has made us all unique. We have special qualities and characteristics and skills, and it's only right that we should want to try and develop them, to realise who we are as individuals. What the prodigal does is to take that essential desire and turn it into something very selfish. He takes all the time, and he doesn't have regard for other people. He only serves himself, and therein lies the path to destructive relationships.
In the first part of our discussion, we talked about the prodigal son and how he created upset in the family. We turn our attention now to the elder brother. How would you describe him?
Well, in some respects, he is the innocent victim in all this. He's done nothing wrong. And yet when the prodigal son returns, he gets very angry. And he gets very sort of upset, and you can feel the bitterness coming through in what he says. And that anger spills over into the situation and leads to further division between himself and his younger brother.
So isn't he justified, though? I mean, we all get angry sometimes, and expressing it's quite natural.
It is very natural, and if you think about the elder brother a bit more, he's done nothing wrong. He's a dutiful son, he works on the fields, he doesn't ask for special treatment, he's very respectful of his father. But when the prodigal returns, something is triggered in his mind, whether it's all that pent-up frustration of being a dutiful son all these years and seeing how the errant brother is received, well, he goes ballistic. And you can sense that anger in what he says. He calls his father you. You know, it's a very disrespectful way of talking to his father in that culture. And he also refers, interestingly, to his brother as this son of yours, as if he's decoupling himself from being his brother. And that is itself a very real indication of how he's distancing himself from the relationship with his younger sibling.
When we feel aggrieved, often what we're looking for is justice.
That's right, and justice is a very important part of our social makeup. We all need systems of justice to live by, to live in harmony, to live socially, to live well. And we've worked on our systems of justice over centuries. They haven't just appeared overnight. And for most of the time, they work well because they allow us to live in relative freedom, in relative peace, and in harmony with each other. But sometimes we can use that in order to dictate onto the person who's aggrieved us something other than justice, which is a sort of retribution, demanding more in order to make us perhaps feel a bit better about the situation we find ourselves in.
So how should we react when we feel aggrieved, when we feel angry?
It's very difficult, and I think we're all prone to playing the victim card from time to time, that when we are wronged, it's natural for us to feel affronted and angry and perhaps bitter. And what we need to try and do is to get rid of those negative emotions, to get them out of our system, because when we do that, we will have a clearer understanding of what we need to do to build up relationship again. The difficulty is, of course, that we can't do that very easily on our own. These destructive emotions can be very circular, can stay with us for a long time. So we need people to help us to offload that, people we can turn to, people who will listen to us, absorb some of those destructive emotions to free us from them. And in the parable of the prodigal son, of course, this is where the father comes in.
Let's start this section by summarising what the parable of the prodigal son tells us about the need for reconciliation.
There are two tensions that are described in the parable of the prodigal son. One, the prodigal himself, who's very self-centred, and in his actions that leads to a broken relationship. The second is the elder brother, whose demand for justice and his bitterness and his anger also leads to that rift between the two brothers and a widening of the breakdown between them. And then, of course, we have the father who has to try and bridge the gap somehow.
So he comes into the story. What is it that he actually does to bridge that gap?
Well, he has to do two things. He has to have a different strategy for each of the protagonists. In some respects, it's easy to deal with the prodigal son. The prodigal son comes back with his tail between his legs, throwing himself at the mercy of his father. And the father has huge compassion for him. He embraces him from a great distance, brings him back, puts new robes on him, has a wonderful party for him. And I think the interesting thing there is that he does all this without the prodigal son saying the word sorry.
Why is that so important?
Because in doing that, he shows that all these wonderful reactions, his compassion, his care, his desire to have his younger son back in the fold, outweighs any destructive thing that the son going away in the first place might have given him. He doesn't feel the need to berate his younger son. He doesn't need to tell him, what on earth have you been doing? How dare you go away like this? He's just glad to have him back. And I think for me that shows that compassion and that desire to be together again overturns any requirement for penance. So the compassion precedes the penitence.
What does the father do towards the elder brother?
Well, of course, a different strategy is required here. He can't just embrace him and say, there, because he's got all this anger to deal with. And what he does here is to act as some sort of lightning conductor for all that anger. And he takes it upon himself to hear and to receive all these destructive emotions in an attempt to try and ensure that the older brother gets rid of them so he can then begin the process of seeing some good coming out of the return of the prodigal son. But it's a very long process, and that's why what the father does is truly sacrificial, because he has to absorb all these destructive emotions to try and liberate his elder son from them.
Do you think the father has a choice in this situation?
Of course he does. We all have a choice to make. He could easily stand back from the situation and say they've got to sort it amongst themselves. It's nothing to do with me. But being the father of his children, he can't but be drawn into the process of trying to get some reconciliation between them by showing compassion to the younger son, the prodigal, but also that sense of trying to alleviate his elder son from all the hurt that he has. And that's a very difficult thing to do. But he's almost got no control over that because of the emotional pull that draws him into that process to try and achieve the reconciliation that he knows is the only way that the whole family can go forward together.
So we've looked at all three characters in the parable. What general lessons do you think we can draw from them about reconciliation?
I think the prodigal son is a metaphor for our individuality. What makes us individuals, individual people and so on, and the sorts of things that we want to do to realise our potential. That's a God-given aspect of who we are as people. The elder brother is symbolic of that system of justice, that system of how we live together in society to make sure that we don't put strains and stresses on how we live together and work together to make a good society where everybody can feel as if they belong and if they've got worth attached to them. The interesting thing for me is that when both those very honourable aspects of what it is to be human are overplayed and overemphasised, it can lead to destruction. That if I'm over-selfish, if I'm overweening with my sense of justice, then that can damage relationship and lead to exclusion and the need for reconciliation.
But there isn't a really neat, tidy ending to this parable, is there?
There is not, and it's a very important thing to say that the parable does not end with the phrase, "they all lived happily ever after." We have no idea of knowing just what the prodigal son did in the future. The story does not say he was sorry, and therefore has his character changed? We don't know. We have no way of knowing if the anger and the bitterness of the elder brother was somehow alleviated and that he was reconciled with his younger sibling. We just don't know what that process is. We just don't know the resolution. And I think Jesus is being very clever here in not giving a nice, neat ending to the story, because actually the process of reconciliation doesn't always have nice, neat endings.
How can the church be involved in reconciliation?
A very good question. And as we all know, in recent times, the church has itself been in need of reconciliation because of its recent history in all sorts of ways. And I think that only goes to show the dynamics of what is entailed when we talk about reconciliation. None of us is immune from being part of breaking relationships. We can all be assertive, we can all be judgmental, and therefore we all need reconciliation. But equally, I think the experience of being involved in that will give us some insight into how relationships can be fostered, can be healed, can be held, and so that those who seek reconciliation are probably in a good position to be able to offer reconciliation in return. And once we're involved in the processes of reconciliation, we're actually doing what the Father does in that story. We're actually doing what Jesus wants us to do. And through his grace and through his mercy and guided by his Spirit, if we are involved in the processes of reconciliation, then we will be instrumental through the grace of God to making the kingdom a greater reality in our lives and in the lives of those people who need his reconciliation.
Thank you, Roger.